Okay, thank you. Two preliminary comments. First of all, this is very unlike churches, because in churches people usually sit at the back, not at the front. So, the second comment is that it's difficult to try to communicate with those who are not particularly scientists, and so I hope I can do that, but if you don't understand something, please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question, and maybe I can clarify. So I'll do my best on that. Okay. Just try to give you an overview of primarily the findings that we've had over the course of 60 years of study of the atomic bomb survivors here at RERF, which formerly was known as the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. That was its initial name, ABCC, but in 1975 that was changed. Okay, here's an outline of the general topics I want to cover. First of all, the very early effects of the atomic bomb, then the formation of the ABCC and the groups that we have under study, how we estimate doses, and so on. And then to move on to the health effects, cancer risks, non-cancer risks, special groups such as those who were prenatal at the time of exposure. And then what about the next generation? Are they at high risk for disease as well? And then finally, sort of a closing, some applications of the A-bomb studies. Well, first of all, the devastation and the acute health effects. The atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a tremendous amount of energy, as you know. The one in Nagasaki was estimated to have 21, I guess, kilotons of dynamite equivalent. The one in Hiroshima was, I think, around 16. But about 50% of the energy they released was actually in the form of blast and shock wave. And these, the scale of how far out these went isn't the total scale. Beyond what's shown, there were, much smaller and smaller and smaller amounts of these released, but this is the way this was done anyway. 35% is heat, infrared rays, which were so intense that many people were killed almost instantly by it. Many others suffered severe burns and so on, as you'll see in a minute. And then 15% is ionizing radiation, and that's what we're much concerned about today. And there were primarily two types, one called gamma rays and one called neutrons. Neutrons have a lot more impact per hitting a cell than do the gamma rays, but on the other hand, the gamma rays were much more numerous. Only roughly 1% or less of the radiation was of the neutron form. Well, the devastation to the infrastructure was just terrible. This is Nagasaki. This is the Urakami Cathedral, which is very well known, and it's been restored today. You can visit it. It's a particular site of veneration because of the many in the area who lost their lives. And the atomic bomb itself was somewhere over here. I can't tell you exactly where, but not that far away. But you can see that most buildings were either flattened by the blast or burned. To humans, the devastation was also terrific. And if you sort of zero in on one or two people, you can see some of the effects, and also the, just the tremendous mental effects of it. They've just been through a terrible trauma, totally unexpected, and so it's really a terrible thing. Here's someone whose skin was terribly burned and they're trying to treat it. Maybe you've been to the Peace Park already, have you? Okay, so you've probably seen a lot more than this. Well, no one knows for sure how many early casualties there were from the atomic bombing, but at least pretty good estimates are that out of roughly 360,000 who were in Hiroshima at the time, about 140,000 had died by the end of 1945. Now, a lot of those died immediately or almost immediately from the blast and from the burns and so on, but others died of acute radiation sickness, and we really don't know the numbers of those three different causes, and of course they're correlated too. But it's thought that about 220,000 were surviving at the end of 1945, and you can see similar figures for Nagasaki here. So out of perhaps 600,000 who were exposed, roughly a third of them probably had died within just a few months.
I have a real quick question. So at the
Yeah.
end of 1945, is that like the spike of deaths or like?
No. Well, a large number of deaths would have been within the first day or immediate or whatever, but then it extended out. People get severe burns and they get immune depression and so on, and they die after a few days or weeks or something.
It just seems like that's too restricted into 45. I would prefer something maybe the end of 46 to have a better idea.
Oh, perhaps, but I think most of the early deaths probably happened by the end of 45 or very soon thereafter. Even if it's radiation sickness, that process evolves within a very few months, because basically the cells of the small intestine and also the white blood cells are knocked out, and if they can't replenish, then the person goes on to die. And that's a process that's pretty well documented as to the time course, which depends on the dose and so on, but it's pretty much over by the end of 45.
What is the margin of error in these estimates?
I don't have a clue.
Plus or minus 10,000 for the deaths.
Okay.
I'm surprised that it's that close. I've seen estimates anywhere from 180,000 to 240,000, but whatever.
This is the official city.
Oh, okay.
statement. It's also quite arbitrary.
Yes.
I'm not sure you can answer this, but we've heard in the last few days when we've been here that there are now just under 200,000 survivors who are still living. How do we correlate that number with this total of 400,000? I'm just trying to do the math here. Is that 195,000 of that 400,000, or is there some other figure that we're talking about when we talk about survivors?
Well, presumably it's out of the 400,000. I can't speak very specifically, but you have to remember these people were of all ages at the time of the bombing, and lots of them have died from natural causes. We all suffer mortality.
I'm a little surprised that 68 years later, almost half of that number is still living.
I'm a little surprised at that too. I think that's a little higher than our estimates. I'll show you in just a couple of minutes that we have survivors whom we've been following up since 1950, and for them, only about 38% are still alive. Did you want something?
I want to pick up your questions on the video, so I will just raise your hand and I'll do the math.
Okay, sounds good. I'll wait until they get the mic then. Okay, well, let's talk a bit about the actual studies we've done here. And I'll define terms as I go along, I hope. If not, again, please raise your hands. Well, first of all, for the better part of a year, I guess, There were meetings between Japanese government and the US government about the matter of the medical and health needs of these survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And out of that came a memorandum to President Harry Truman in which they said, look, we can't just think about studying or finding out what's going on for the next year or so. We really need a long-term commitment to evaluate the health effects of radiation, because at that time very little was known about the health effects of radiation. There were some things known, but an awful lot that we know today was not known then. But moreover, there was a concern about their health, their status, their well-being. So those two combined meant that indeed there was an agreement to have a long-term study. Well, because of that agreement, authorization was given to the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. to form a study. And fortunately, in 1950, it was possible to get a question on the national Japanese census asking, were you in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or Nagasaki at the time of the bombing? And about 284,000 responded yes. Of those 284,000, we were able to determine that about 195,000 were still residing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the prefectures, which is more or less like a province or a state, if you will. So from that 195,000, we chose 120,000 people for study. We essentially chose all of those who were still residents here, who had resided, who were within 2,500 meters at the time of the bombing, and then a random subsample of those who were more distant. And in addition to the 93,000 survivors we brought in that way, we had 27,000 who were not in the cities at the time of the bombing, but who subsequently returned or newly came to the cities, and who were there as of 1950. They serve as a kind of comparison group, so you can get an idea of what about people who are totally unexposed, and compare the health experience of those who've had varying degrees of exposure. Well, then in 1958, we also formed what we call our adult health study. We started hopefully to get in 20,000 people out of these 93,000 survivors, but we succeeded in getting about 17,000 of them, which by today's standards is remarkable to get that high a percentage. But anyway, it was done, and we'll hear more about it as we go on. Then a little later on, we said, well, we really ought to be studying those who were in the womb at the time of the bombing. And we went backward in time to identify them back to 1946 and developed a cohort of all those we could find who were in the womb then, so 3,600. And later we began a clinical study of them. And then we also said, well, genetic effects were a very big concern in the early days. It was thought that that was the primary effect of radiation, based on some animal data going back to the 1920s when Dr. Muller won a Nobel Prize for studying radiation genetics in fruit flies. But anyway, so we said, well, we ought to look at the F1 generation, that's the children of the atomic bomb survivors. And we identified 77,000 of them, of whom for 41,000 we know have a pretty good idea of the estimated doses for both the father and the mother. And quite recently we've begun a clinical study of a subset of those. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, did you create a subset in the offspring of survivors between those that had two parents that were survivors versus those who intermarried with those who were not survivors?
We do have a number for whom both parents were exposed, and for whom we know that. But there were quite a few for whom, as you can see, for whom we didn't know, for both parents, about 30,000. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Just kind of the idea is that whether they identified a subset to see if there was more effects if both parents were survivors versus a single parent was survivor. Or imagine you probably had some things with male-female, which is easier to do. I was just curious on that to see if there was a greater chance of an effects of after exposure of both parents.
We have analyzed that, and the two seem pretty independent, the exposure of the mother and the exposure of the father. If you put the two together, it doesn't really look any different than you'd expect. But I'll mention a couple of other things with regard to that. A lot of those where we don't know for both parents. One parent was not in Hiroshima at the time, and for many purposes we say we don't know the dose of that person, although it's probably zero. Second thing is that consanguinity was quite common then, which means marrying like first cousins or that sort of thing in Japan. And so some roughly 5% of the marriages in those days were due to, were consanguineous marriages. So in doing some of the studies, we had to sort that out, because if you have close relatives who are intermarried, that, for instance, gives you a larger genetic risk and so on. So there are a lot of angles to doing these studies. Now, I still, I guess, haven't really said what a cohort means. Cohort means a group of a population, if you will, that you follow up over time to see some kind of experience. So these people, the lifespan study, we're still following them today. The adult health study, we've been bringing them in every 2 years for health examinations, and I'll show you more about that, please.
Yeah, two questions. Is your definition of ABOM survivor the same as the one we've heard in the last 2 days of is it 2 days, 2 kilometers within 2 days of the, Steve, you help me out there, what's the?
2 kilometers, 2 weeks.
2 kilometers within 2 weeks of the event. Is that your definition for this study?
No. As I said, we got essentially everyone who was within 2,500 meters of the hypocenter being the ground location immediately under the bomb. And then we got a random sample of others out to 10 kilometers away. That's roughly, a little over 6 miles away from the bomb. So we did not consider anything about those who entered subsequently who were not in Hiroshima at the time of the bomb. We do have some information on such people, though, and they indeed, among those who were in this 27,000, we know something about whether they entered early on or not. Unfortunately, those data are not very good, so we have not made a whole lot of them. Remember, the information was gathered back in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and if we had it to do over again, we'd do it better and so on, but you can't.
That leads to my second question. The 1950 census, is that number going to be artificially low because of a cultural stigma around admitting that one was a survivor?
I think that's possible. We just don't know. On the other hand, given, we're only working with those who admitted it, and so there could be some non-representativeness in all of that, but we've never had any way to try to determine that. Those are good questions, receptive. Okay, well, if you're going to make much sense out of things scientifically, you can't just say they're exposed or they're not exposed, because, for instance, those who are 1,500 meters away from the bomb had tremendously more exposure than those who were 8 kilometers away. So one big task that we've undertaken over the course of the years actually is to produce the best estimates we can of how much exposure each individual had based on early interviews back in the 1940s, 50s, and extending a little into the early 1960s with many, most of the survivors, or at least a representative of the family. And from that, we have developed information on those most of those 93,000 as to what their estimated doses are. Now, this shows you a map for Hiroshima. If you can see the little square or the little plus sign here, that's the hypocenter. And you'll notice that in here it's all gray, unknown, and the reason being that almost everyone in those distances died immediately or in the first few months. Hardly anybody survived. The doses were so high, plus the fire and the blast. So it's really not until you get out to something like 800 to 1,000 meters, and unfortunately we don't have a circle for that, where you begin to see people, but they had very high exposures, and I'll talk more about what the meaning of these doses are. This is abbreviation for a word called gray. But as you go further out, you can see that the doses get lower and lower. Well, the doses were not only defined by distance from the epicenter, from the bomb, but they were also defined by the shielding configuration. And I guess I don't have that slide in, but anyway, we did, for about 23,000 of those who were closest in, we did very detailed questions and diagrams and so on to identify the shielding configurations, and it had to do with what building were they in, what about buildings between them and the bomb that were fairly close by, what was their orientation toward the bomb, did they happen to be facing it, or were they have their back to it, or whatever, because that would affect things like the eyes or the breast, because of the built-in shielding by your body if you were facing away from it. So we went through all of those things, and we came up with organ doses for individuals for the, I guess, 86,000. And here's sort of a schematic of it. First of all, 26,000 who were not in the city, or 27,000 not in the city. Of the 93,000 survivors, we have good estimated doses for 86,000. But there were about 7,000 who were in such complex shielding configurations, such as, for instance, a Densha, a streetcar, where there'd be lots of other people around them and various windows and so on. You simply couldn't figure what the dose was to such a person. Or in a heavily shielded building with windows, where if you happen to be quite close to the window, you get a very big dose, but if you were just a foot or two removed, you get much, much smaller. So, it's very hard to estimate doses in such situations. Yes?
Two questions. One is, I'm assuming that the dosage you're talking about is the direct dose from the explosion itself, not from contamination from the contact.
Yes, that's right.
And so in order to estimate the direct dose you're talking about, then based on calculations of what the radiation dose would be at that distance from fundamental physics, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Physicists at several different institutions, Los Alamos, the Oak Ridge, the SAIC, what's that stand for? Scientific Applications Incorporated or something, used hours and hours and hours of computer time back in those days to try to do what they call transport models, where you take billions of particles and you transport them, foot by foot, and get them finally to the person, and then you do some other things. Well, I'm not a physicist, I don't know the details, but it's it was very intensive work that was done.
Thank you.
I guess I should say here that you can see that because of the way we selected people, a large fraction of them had quite small doses and only relatively few had really high doses of over, let's say, half a grade. And in a minute I'll talk about the meaning of those dose units a little more. Okay, here we are.
Just
Sorry.
one more question following
Yeah.
on what we've said so far. Because you're estimating here the doses received as a direct result of being in the area of the bomb, if you stayed in the area for several days because you weren't able to get out or you were just in that versus some of that population left. We listened to the story of a survivor who was able to get out of the city relatively quickly and didn't experience any blackburn and things like that. Presumably that person received a lot less radiation than someone who might have been staying right next door in the same situation but stayed in the city for another day or two longer and had blackburn. How do you distinguish that? How do you separate those doses of radiation that they got from subsequent from what they got initially?
Well, I think maybe there's some misperception there, and it's not your fault. I think it's the fault of the people communicating it. There were very widespread fires, and people simply could not stay in very close to the bomb. They had to leave or they died, sort of thing. However, many people did come back in, let's say on the next day or day after or several days later, trying to find relatives and things like that. There are two things that go on. One is that quite close into the bomb, there's what's called neutron activation of soil and of other metallic things that gives a dose. But then there was also the potential for fallout from the bomb. And there have been a lot of measurements made, especially in Nagasaki, but quite a few in Hiroshima as well. And really, when they back calculate to what the doses would have been in the early days afterward, the fallout doses in Hiroshima were not very large at all. And so people who were, let's say, 2 kilometers away from the bomb would have gotten a lot more from just the direct exposure than they would have from coming in later on. In Nagasaki, there's an exception to that. There's one area called Nishiyama where there was indeed a very substantial fallout, a rainout, if you will, and they got a pretty appreciable fallout exposure. You can say that's a biased take on it on my part, but I would say it's also a biased take on some other people's parts. So anyway, if I may move on, let's look a little bit at what doses mean. Now, I talked about gray up till now, but for all practical purposes, a gray is the same as a sievert for what we need to talk about today. And a millisievert means 1/1000th of a sievert, or 1/1000th of a gray, if you will. So if we talk about other sources of radiation exposure, natural background radiation, an average across the world, is about 2.4 millisievert per year. So every year you're getting that much. The average for medical exposures is about 2 per year, but actually in the United States it's about 3. Both the United States and Japan have about the highest rates of medical procedures, exposures of any countries in the world. But of course, this doesn't apply to everyone. Some people get a lot more than 3 millisievert or 2 millisievert. Some don't get any from medical. but that's a kind of average. If you talk about what about some of the diagnostic procedures, well, you can see chest x-rays, dental x-rays give very little exposure. Mammography, a little bit more. But when you come to CT examinations, you're all familiar with what CT means. Okay. The doses are considerably larger. But even so, here's the mean dose for atomic bomb survivors on the order of 200 millisievert compared to 10 or 15 millisievert from a CT examination. You can say, well, okay, we're still talking about dose levels that are much higher, and do they really apply down at those low practical levels where people get exposed today? Well, I could mention, lethal whole body dose is up around 3 to 5 sievert, which is 3,000 to 5,000 millisievert. Well, it turns out that those what look like fairly small doses from CT examinations, by comparison, actually add up. Let's start here. There's a study published 4 years ago, actually done in 2007. They took a large representative sample of about 31,000 patients in the U.S. who received CT examinations that year. Okay, and it was in a record system where they could go backward in time for 20 or more years, and so they did calculate the cumulative effective doses from CT examinations only over the previous 20 years. Lo and behold, when they did that, of these people who had the CT exam in 2007, 15% of them had enough CT exams that when they did the calculations of what the presumed doses were, it was greater than 100 millisievert, and 4% had over 250 millisievert. Well, since about 25 million people in 2007 had CT exams, if you project these percentages out to that 25 million, you can see you're talking about close to 4 million with 100 millisievert, and 1 million with 250 millisievert. And then backing up, we're talking about an average dose of 200 millisievert. So we're not talking about doses that are that different from what people are receiving. However, there's a difference. What we're talking about is receiving that dose in 1 minute or less, whereas there you're talking about getting it in increments over the course of 20 years or more. But still, I think it's kind of realistic to think that there may well be effects that from the atomic bomb study that are applicable to the population.
Isn't that kind of, when you're talking about the atomic bomb survivors, you're only showing what the bomb gave and not everything else. Like that measurement, correct me if I'm wrong, but that measurement of the CT scans, that includes what that person has in them from not only the CT, but other things, right? Background radiation, etc.
No, this is purely the estimated doses from CT. The other is not calculated and not put in.
Okay, when we go back to the previous slide where you showed us what the average CT.
Well, okay, let's just take an example here. The abdomen and pelvis CT, 15 millisievert, and yet we find that 4% had over 250 millisievert. That means those people were getting probably 15 or more CT examinations.
Okay, thanks.
And that's not uncommon. Now, it's not a random sample who get that many, it's people who have one conditions of one sort or another. Okay, finally, what kinds of outcomes have we looked at? Well, we've certainly looked at causes of death in the lifespan study, the 120,000. We also, we actually formed the first tumor registries in Japan back in 1958 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki prefectures, and have been operating them ever since. so we can look at cancer incidence, that is the occurrence of new first cancers in people, and it also provides a means for us to get to pathological tissues so that we can examine in more detail the subtypes of cancer and so on. Then in the adult health study, the 17,000 who've come in for that, we can examine diseases and health conditions which are non-fatal, whereas up here we're limited to cancer that's non-fatal or fatalities. And then we also obtain biological materials which allow a whole variety of studies to be done. And this shows the stored samples that we have in biological. We have serum samples on close to 15,000 people from the adult health study. And for most of them we have multiple samples such that you can see the number of tubes. They typically take a sample and divide it into several tubes. So that's not the number of samples. Blood cells we get, and plasma and urine. For blood cells, some of them we go through a process by which you can transform them some and then store them in liquid nitrogen. This is a liquid nitrogen container here, and keep the cells viable, keep them so they're still living, so you can do things with them which you couldn't do with just dead cells on a slide or something. Okay, radiation exposure and cancer. One could consider, is there really risk at low doses of cancer? And in fact, there are a lot of radiation biologists who say, no, there's not. They say the curve should look like just goes straight out at zero till you get to some dose point, and then it starts to go up. Well, we don't find that. We find that, for practical purposes, it looks like it goes down to approximately zero in terms of excess risk. Okay, I should talk about that, I'm sorry. A percent excess relative risk. No relative risk would be the baseline if you had no exposure. Okay, that's 0 point. A 50% excess relative risk means you had 50% more risk of whatever it is, in this case cancer. Or the relative risk would be 1.5 because 50% more would be 1.5. And 100% excess relative risk would be a doubling of the risk. So what you see here is that at one gray of dose, you have almost a 50% excess of solid cancer risk. And this is a combination of all different solid cancers. It's not including leukemia or lymphomas. Those are much more rare than solid cancers. A second thing to know about cancer risk is that radiation affects a wide number of organs and tissues, so that very many of them show an excess in relation to radiation exposure. Now, I need to say something about these different bars here. These are what are called confidence intervals, and they indicate the precision of particular estimates. And in fact, the shorter the bar, the more precise the estimate, which is sort of counterintuitive. But for all solid cancers, you can see the bar is very short because we have big numbers of them, over 10,000 solid cancers we're estimating. Whereas for something like bladder cancer down here with only 177, you have a very wide bar because it's not a very precise estimate. But there are a few sites where we haven't seen significant increases, and those are the blue ones. And we don't understand the biology of that at this point, but it's there. And there are some other sites that aren't on here. For instance, brain tumors are in excess with radiation. Thyroid cancer, very sharp excess for those who were exposed as children. Leukemia is perhaps the largest relative risk, and it was so large that it was just off the scale. If you plotted that, it'd be way over here on the right somewhere. But leukemia is a pretty rare condition, and so even though the relative risk is large, the absolute numbers are not all that large. Okay, another thing about radiation and cancer is who's sensitive to it and how long does the risk last? Well, it turns out that those who are young at exposure are at higher risk of getting cancer from radiation than those who are older. And let's say, for instance, those who reach attained age of 60 years, if they were exposed at age 40, this is about their risk, age 30, 20, and 10. So you can see that the risk goes up pretty consistently related to how young they are. Second thing is that risk seems to last throughout the lifetime. We don't have the full lifetime for everybody, particularly those who are really young at exposure yet, but we don't see any indication that it's stopping, and it's likely that it's going to keep on going up. So one can't say, well, okay, you have a 15-year risk of cancer from radiation. It's there for lifetime in all likelihood. In addition to cancer, there are other health effects, and one of the big ones that's come up just in the last few years is risk of heart disease. And prior to mainly our study, it was thought that doses of below about 4 or 5 gray to the heart would not cause any heart disease, based on radiotherapy studies where the heart was getting very high doses and so on. And so they call this kind of a dose effect threshold. There's a threshold below which you don't get any. Well, in our data, it doesn't look that way. This is sort of a confidence bar, if you will, this gray area, but the best estimate, you can see it's going up. However, there's quite a bit of uncertainty with this below about half a gray, so we don't make a strong statement about what's going on down there. We think there may be excess risk, but we're not sure. But above half a gray, we're pretty sure there is an excess risk. And when we go to our adult health study, looking at clinical indicators, sure enough, we find that circulatory system inflammation is increased. That's what the up arrow means with regard to radiation dose. Blood lipids are changed, cholesterol and triglycerides, they also increase with radiation dose. And some other cardiovascular risk factors such as blood pressure goes up and calcification of the arteries. So we have some pretty good confirmation that there is a real risk for heart disease below the dose levels that they were talking about. Similar story for cataracts. The International Commission on Radiological Protection, commonly called the ICRP, for many years said to protect the eye of workers or others, you don't need to worry if you keep the cumulative doses below about 5 gray. We, on the other hand, showed that at least down to half a gray, we're seeing excess risk of cataract. And so just within the last 2 years, the ICRP has issued a new statement saying that instead of a dose limit of 5 gray, it's now half a gray, 10-fold reduction. So that's been an important thing. And it's caused some consternation because there are some medical people, interventional cardiologists who do kind of real-time insertion of catheters into the heart and stuff like that, who were getting very appreciable eye doses because they sort of have to bend over the patient and so on. And many of them already have more than half a gray, so it's become difficult. Well, you know, what do you do in those cases? Do you say, bye-bye, you must retire, or how do you handle that? Okay, moving on. I would be remiss if I didn't say something about psychological effects, although this is something we have not studied all that much, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But it's pretty clear that, you know, from the atomic bombings, you had trauma from burns, acute radiation illness, there were deaths in the family, there was socioeconomic damage, your businesses were destroyed, and so on, and that those were all stress factors that could lead to post-traumatic stress disorder or other kinds of psychological symptoms. And then there were longer-term factors, such as the worries about maybe getting leukemia or other types of cancer. There were certainly poor living conditions for a number of years after the bombings. And there was discrimination and stigma for the atomic bomb survivors. My guess is you probably have heard some about that at the Peace Memorial Museum. And these all add to the stress leading to chronic psychological symptoms. Well, it's not directly a radiation effect for the most part. One study that we published 11 years ago, I guess, did show that those who had acute radiation illness, they in fact did have higher levels of psychological distress some 30 or more years later. But if you looked at those who did not have the acute radiation sickness, there was no association with the dose level. Those who were out at 8 kilometers had just as much psychological symptomatology as those who were 1.5 kilometers away. So it looks like it's mainly the social factors, if you will, and the fear and so on that are really the driving force for the psychological symptoms. But of course, if the bombings hadn't occurred, that would all not be there. So is it a radiation effect or is it not? It's kind of hard to judge that, I guess. Risks after prenatal exposure are another topic. Early on, we found that there was an excess of mental retardation among those who were exposed in utero, but it was limited to a window of time from about 8 weeks post-conception to 25 weeks post-conception. And there we saw excess frank mental retardation. For those who were exposed before 8 weeks or after 25 weeks, we saw no effect whatsoever with regard to mental retardation. This is not common. There are only like 25 cases here that we're talking about that couldn't be accounted for by other factors, genetic factors or whatever. But nevertheless, it's something to think about. And then we went on and did studies and said, well, okay, those were really severe effects. What about the general population here? Were they also affected mentally by the bombings? And so it was possible to give IQ tests to children, I forget what grade it was in, like second or third grade in school, who were in fact in utero at the time of the bombings. And when those data were looked at, for those who were 0 to 7 or greater than 25 weeks post-conception at the time of the bombing, there wasn't really any clear effect in terms of IQ. But if you looked at those at 8 to 15 weeks or 16 to 25 weeks, the higher the dose, the lower the mean IQ. So it's pretty clear that it's quite a general effect that occurred. Now can I just say one more sentence? Now we're interested in, is there also an increase in dementia among those who were exposed in utero or as young children? We're just beginning that study. We don't yet have any answers, but in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to, I think, learn a fair amount about that. Okay, question?
It just intrigues me, do you have data on any miscarriages that occurred? So there might have been, do you have a record of dosage versus miscarriage when they were pregnant and miscarriage shortly after?
Not specifically. I will say a few words about a study that we conducted early on, looking at, not at miscarriage per se, but looking at whether there were fetal malformations among those whose mothers or fathers had been exposed to the atomic bombs earlier. This is this F1 generation now, and not those who were actually in utero at the time. No, we don't have the kind of information you're asking about. One thing you have to understand is that in the early days, the medical system was not was chaotic, frankly, because of the bombing and so on. And so there were a number of things that we wish we could have looked at, but it couldn't have been done because of the way the medical system was trying to pull itself together and so on. I'll just mention also that for a long time there's been a thought that those who were in utero in exposure have very high risks of cancer, the highest risks of any group. And that's based on several different studies, quite a few studies in fact, of childhood leukemia in relation to diagnostic radiation exposures, which it used to be that radiography was used quite a bit to see was the child in the right position in the womb and things like that. Well, in our study, now looking at 55 years of follow-up of those who were exposed in utero, we do indeed find an effect for those who are exposed in utero, but it's actually looking like it's less than among those who were exposed at 0 to 5 years of age. Now, it's not a significant difference between those two groups at this point. Another maybe 10 years of observation and we'll have a better handle on that. But at least it doesn't seem that those exposed in utero have a lifetime cancer risk that's greater than those exposed in childhood. Okay, heritable genetic effects. As I mentioned early on, this is an area that initially was thought to be extremely important. We've done a variety of studies, and I'll just list some of the other kinds in a minute, to look at this. And on this particular slide, if 0 represents no effect, okay? And the bars then and their confidence intervals indicate what our estimates of the risk are. Well, let's look at first at the right side. For cancer, we don't see any significant effect of the parental exposure, either the mother's dose or the father's dose, or if we put them together, the combined doses. Similarly, for non-cancer, we don't see any effect. However, do I say it on here? I guess I don't. However, this particular slide represents those who are only up to about age 50 on average at the time of the ascertainment. And that's still awfully early to think about what's the ultimate lifetime cancer risk or non-cancer risk. So we don't regard these results as definitive, but at least we're not seeing some huge degree of risk at this point among those who are offspring of the atomic bomb survivors. We've looked at a lot of other things. I mentioned the birth defects. We've looked at stillbirths, deformities, perinatal death, and we haven't seen any evidence of a dose-related effect. To geneticists, sex ratio is something that they think may be altered by radiation, but we haven't seen that. And well, chromosome aberrations, I'll show you more about this on the next slide, but again, we've not seen any excess chromosome aberrations in the children of the atomic bomb survivors in relation to dose. Here's an example. This is actually from a survivor who had a very high dose, but it's good for illustrating what you can see in looking at chromosome aberrations today. And all these little arrows point to chromosomes where there is a recombination that's not what it should be, an aberration, in other words. And you can see that, with this kind of technique, it's pretty easy to identify chromosome aberrations. And we're setting out to use this technique with offspring of parents who've had a whole range of doses, so that we can see in that F1 generation, do we see effects like this? Well, what are some of the applications of our data? All of the major risk assessment groups, two major ones here, called UNSCEAR, United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which does every several years a radiation report. They use the risk data that we develop as their primary basis for projecting risks. Then the ICRP over here, they take these results, do some of their own massaging of the data, and come up with what they regard as guidelines or standards for how much radiation should be allowed to different organs. And those are adopted very widely by different national agencies, also by the IAEA. And in the U.S., the comparable thing is done by this group. So basically, our data are the primary, basis for risk estimation and for setting standards of how much radiation should be allowed. And the applications are numerous: radiation workers and the amount allowed for the public. Trying to estimate what are the risks from, for instance, CT scans. What about radiation accidents or nuclear terrorism? What do you anticipate in terms of hazards from that? And of course, we're interested in special high-risk groups as well. Well, many people have contributed to this work long before I was here and since I'm here, and I thank them certainly for this, but I especially want to thank the atomic bomb survivors in our adult health study, who very faithfully have come in ever since 1958. Many of them were in our 27th cycle of examinations. No, we're in our 28th, excuse me. And 70% of those who are still alive and still in the areas around the two cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima still come in for those examinations every 2 years. It's quite remarkable, and without them we wouldn't begin to have the data that we do. So thank you. Any final questions? Oh, I see lots of hands here. Okay.
Quick question, do you have like a sister facility to this that's near Nagasaki, just to make it more convenient for most of the survivors there to get their checkups?
Yes, we have a laboratory or a clinical and epidemiologic facility in Nagasaki, and we do things strictly parallel there with what we do here. However, there we don't have the basic science units or the statistics unit. That's all here. But the basic data collection is done in parallel in Nagasaki.
This was a question in relation to nuclear accidents, and I was curious if you know of any formal or informal contacts and discussions in light of the Fukushima incident. Have there been any discussions about applications of research from this to that, or any contact with scientists from here with scientists elsewhere?
I almost included a slide on that. There have been numerous discussions, and we have half a dozen scientists who have one or another type of involvement with the studies there, because they're designing and starting to implement a long-term follow-up, and they don't have any experience with that, whereas we have 60 years of experience with it. So they've looked to us to serve on their advisory groups and give them a lot of input with regard to that. In addition, we have one senior scientist who spent many, many days in Tokyo advising the government with regard to medical aspects of the Fukushima accident. Just recently, he managed to get away from most of that, but he was going out 2 days a week, week after week after week, doing that. So it was a big drain on his time, but something that's important. I don't mean to, you know.
Two questions about the organization. You were created by the U.S. government. Where does the money come to fund all of this?
Okay, well, early on, most of the direct funding was from the U.S. government, and that was because of President Truman's authorization there. But right from, I'd say from day one, the Japanese government, though they didn't have a fund for it as such, they gave a lot of help in kind. And so a lot of the clinicians and those who did field work, because it took a tremendous amount of field work to like get information on the doses and all kinds of things. A lot of that was done by Japanese, supported by the Japanese. So it was kind of a, but it wasn't officially called ABCC monies.
And secondly, I'd be more than
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't. Then in 1975, we signed the new agreement, and then it was 50-50 in terms of funding from the two governments. Now it's more like 60% from the Japanese and 40% from the U.S. But
And how long will this go on as more and more survivors die from old age?
right. Well, I think the nature of the organization is going to change because of the fact that there won't be survivors. However, we do have this F1 generation coming on that we are studying, and that will certainly keep activity going for another 30 or 40 years in potential. And we also have this tremendous biological resource which can be used for all kinds of studies of the molecular and genomic and all these good words, studies of the effects of radiation. And so that will also will shift more and more in that direction, I think. But I don't doubt that the organization will become smaller over time.
One of the factoids we hear from, I forget if it's in the U.S. or just in the industrialized nations as a whole, is that 1 in 2 women and 1 in 3 men will be diagnosed with some form of cancer in their lifetime. Can you tell me what those numbers were prior to 1945?
I think that may be a little high. I think it's more like 40% rather than 50%. In the U.S., I think in Japan they project something like 35% currently, if I'm not mistaken. Before 1945, I don't know, but I would say there's a lot of uncertainty there because medical care procedures and documentation was much different than it is today. And for instance, it was a stigma to have cancer, and so families were not informed that their aunt or mother or whatever had cancer. And in the medical system, it often was not noted. So I think that because of the stigma and other factors, it would be very hard to compare.
You mentioned about the genetic effects of the radiation, and you talked about specifically the chromosome aberrations. My question is there evidence for specific mutations of DNA for radiation and diseases caused by mutations in DNA? Data on that specifically?
Do we have data on that,
Yes.
or is there out in the literature?
Yes.
We don't really have data on that at this point, and that's an area that I'm sure we're going to be expanding into more. We do have a study ongoing at the moment just to see in general if you have our estimation of what the dose is, and you know the cancer outcomes, and then you also know the chromosome aberrations. Do the aberrations predict the cancer risk above and beyond what you would predict from just knowing the dose without knowing anything about them? We don't have any results at the moment, so I can't tell you the answer, but
Thank you.
I think in general, the chromosome aberrations have been thought to be more a marker of exposure than a marker of disease, although there certainly are some diseases where certain specific chromosome aberrations are implicated.
I had two questions. First is, the patients who were part of this study, what do they benefit from besides just contributing something to science?
Thank you for asking that. I forgot to say it. There are a variety of things. One of the most important is screening and early detection of disease when they come in for their examinations. In the last couple of years, for instance, we've detected a leukemia, and we've also detected a lymphoma case, malignant lymphoma, which were completely unknown, but we picked them up through our examinations of the blood samples, and so we quickly got back to them and got them referred to medical, institutions for treatment. So there's that kind of thing, and maybe much more mundane, we pick up things like so-called metabolic syndrome, which is a risk factor for diabetes and also for heart disease, and we give some counseling, not directive counseling because we don't feel that's our role, but certainly suggesting that things change. So it's good for health maintenance and sometimes early detection. Also, sometimes people come with problems and they don't quite know where to turn for the solution to. Could be social problems or health-related problems, and our people are trained to help get them oriented toward the appropriate agency, and even to make the contacts with the agency to open the door for them.
So that means if something happens to them in between their 2-year coming in, that if something happens to them in the middle of that, they could come to you and say, I'm having this problem or that problem, or if a doctor diagnoses something, then would they be able to come here?
Well, there are a couple of ways that gets handled. One is that every 6 months we send them a questionnaire about their health, and if they complete that, we get some more up-to-date information. I can't tell you specifically about people requesting information, but I would be very surprised if we don't help as much as we can, because it's a delicate situation, trying to bring elderly people in time after time after time. You don't just say, oh, I'm glad you came, and forget them for the next 2 years. We want to be as helpful as we can be.
Okay, one other question, it's a different topic. So what about Chernobyl? Has there been any dovetailing of information with regard to that? Has there been any exchanging of information between the former Soviet Union and the organization?
Well, that happens in several different ways, one being just a comparison of our results with the Chernobyl results, thyroid cancer being a primary example of that, where you have a very large excess of thyroid cancer after Chernobyl, and it can be compared. We do have conversations. I personally have done some work in Chernobyl. And another site is Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, which was where most of the atomic bombs were exploded by Russia. We currently have one person who has a project to help assemble data on the health experience of people in Kazakhstan who were downwind from the atomic bombings there. I'm sorry, whoever's next.
Early in the history when it was first formed, how many people did it involve, and wherever the physicians coming from or the scientists.
I mean, how many people were involved as RERF
Right,
workers,
in the-
you're saying?
Right, in the organization.
There was actually a time when there were over 1,000 workers here, as I understand it. And that's decreased over the years. Part of it is because of greater efficiencies. Computers do in fact make you more efficient. Part of it is just because the funding levels have changed and so on. That's the major driving factor, of course. Part of it is that there were things being done in the early days which we don't need to do again, like all these surveys out in the community of the residents to get information on their doses and find out who all was in the family and so on. We don't do that again. So we're now down to about 240 or 230 staff in total.
Yes, is there any comparable study that's done like this in the United States to soldiers and sailors who were exposed to atomic bomb blasts? Part of the reason I'm asking this is I have a sister-in-law whose father died at an early age, who was a sailor on a ship who witnessed some explosions in the South Pacific from shipboard.
Well, there is a study of atomic veterans, which was just begun within the last decade, and they've only looked at mortality. They get mortality records on those they can identify as atomic veterans, and they get whatever radiation dose information they can, but it's not all that great. I mean, many of the people around the bombs, were there, and only one person out of 20 or something actually had a film badge, that kind of thing. And so it's pretty hard to document the radiation exposures with much accuracy. But that study is ongoing, and it's getting improved all the time. I think I mentioned this National Council on Radiation Protection in one of my last slides. Well, the president of that council is actually now working on that study among his many other balls he has juggling in the air.
Are you collecting any information from the people who lived in the area around Fukushima?
We are not. That's being done by the biggest study being done by the Fukushima Medical University, and that's where they're talking about potentially 2 million persons, although I don't think it's going to ever get that large. But there are also other groups that are studying in particular towns, based because the city or the local governments are funding some research. It would be rather difficult to do a study from here because we're, I don't know what it is, 800 or 1,000 miles away, and we'd have to actually have a staff on the ground there and so on to do it. And there are, considerations that we don't want to go in and say, hey, we're the big gorilla, you guys get out of the way and we'll do it. So.
My other question is, have you done any studies on the effect of radiation on soil and honor tables?
No, we haven't. We've not really done any ecological studies, we haven't looked at biota or what you're suggesting.
Are other groups doing that or have done it?
I'm not sure I can answer that. It doesn't ring any bell with me, but that doesn't mean it's not out there somewhere.
I'm going to shift to a little more political question, I guess. I'm curious as to how you feel this research has been embraced or not embraced by the Japanese. And you mentioned that the survivors have been very faithful. Can you comment a little bit on that, and then how you as an organization have to respond when For example, I've picked up on that there seems to be a bit of debate about how far that black rain fell out from the city center and whether or not that has affected people in a certain way and things like that. Do people turn to you for answers, and then if they don't like the answers, do they get upset? I'm curious about that.
Well, we don't have any information on the far out fallout. We have no information beyond 10,000 meters, and they're talking about multiple tens of thousands of meters out. Much of the, I would say most of the measurements that were made early on of soils and so on, which are a way to document the fallout, most of them were within about 5,000 to 7,000 or 8,000 meters. And so there's not a whole lot of information about further out. In terms of our response, maybe I have to turn that over to Mr. Hart as our public relations.
I plan to talk about that issue with the tour, so just if you give me a little bit of time.
And then just also just comment, I think this is a question you might be able to, certainly if you were to undertake a study like this, for just starting a study like this, in this day and age, we're much more sensitive about making sure that the human participants in your study and your research know what their rights are in terms of the research and things like that. Whereas in the 1940s and 1950s, it wasn't that way. And can you comment on how this research is sensitive to that now versus how it used to be a number of years ago?
Well, clearly times have changed, as you say. We have kept up with the current understanding of what should be done, and the Japanese government has guidelines with regard to that, which we faithfully follow. But prior to approximately 2000, we had some informed consent, but it was not nearly as detailed as we now make it. And there are kind of two levels of informed consent. It gets even more extensive if you have the potential to look at genetic information. And so there are really quite a few hoops you have to go through. And we do it, and we realize it's very important to do, but I think there are also concerns that, is it really informed consent? Do people really understand? And I think that isn't just for us, that's throughout the medical community in the U.S., that there's a lot of concern that, are they just signing because the doctor says so, and not because they really understand all the implications and so on. And I don't quite know how to handle that. We try to, well, I shouldn't even say what we try to do in terms of the user-friendliness of our consent forms, because they're in Japanese and I don't read Japanese, but
Thank you.
Any other questions?
That's all we want to thank you very much for your time. We have a small gift for sharing gifts with all the people who honor us with their time. I think Usher.
We appreciate very much your lecture and give you some small tokens. And we thank you for your patience in answering all of our probing questions. Thank you very much.
well, I guess I can say Daijoubu desu and arigatou gozaimasu.